We can discuss all this with Fiona O'Reilly from Catholic Voices, Lavinia Byrne, a former nun who left her religious order over the issue of women priests, Michael Walsh, a Catholic author and historian of the Papal Conclave. But first, Father Christopher Jamieson, who is a former abbot of Worth Abbey and star of the BBC series The Abbey. A lot of popes, for hundreds of years actually, have gone through infirmity and old age and continued in office. Why do you think it stopped him?
Well, I think if we take the previous Pope, John Paul II, he saw his illness as a witness to the importance of people who are sick and infirm, and he wanted people to see him in his infirmity, and he went to the balcony to show them himself and to say, I am still a child of God, and this is an important witness of the importance of caring for the sick and the infirm and the dying. Now, Pope Benedict is not ill, he's just very old. And I think there's a significant difference that because people can now live not so much through illness, but they can live through old age, quite remarkably, for a very long time. He could live with us for many, many more years, and he's aware that actually the declining years of a person who's just aging is quite different to a person who's sick. And so he feels it's right, in all humility, to admit that and to step down.
And do you think it's partly to do with, get onto the spiritual role in a moment, but the managerial role, if I can put it like that, in the church, which is very taxing, and that's where he's run into some trouble, not the spiritual, intellectual, theological side, and it demands somebody who's fitter.
It certainly demands somebody who's fit to deal with what is, you know, a significant organisation. But I also think what's distressed him is, for example, I'm told that his doctors told him he shouldn't do any more transatlantic travel. Now, one of the high points of the Church's life is World Youth Day. The next World Youth Day is in Rio de Janeiro in July, and I think he feels that millions of young Catholics, literally millions of young Catholics, would be very disappointed if we had World Youth Day without the Pope, because World Youth Day is the Pope's personal invitation to the youth of the world, and he probably feels they deserve to have the Pope there.
Do you think, though, in a secular world, we sometimes fail to, particularly in media, we fail to recognise the spiritual side, and we kind of treat him as if he's the head of BP or Apple or Microsoft, as if he's the leader of a big corporation, and that's where his feet gets held to the fire.
I think you've put your finger absolutely on it, that he feels that above all the spiritual role of being the Pope requires energy, you know, to preach, to counsel, to teach. He's above all a teacher, and I think he feels if he can't teach, then of course he's not able to fulfill a key role in the church. And I think you're right. You know, most chief executives don't have to be teachers along with being chief executives.
But did he, he's been widely praised today as an intellectual and theologian, but was he up to the challenges of the modern media and the kind of scrutiny which is relentless on the child abuse and, you know, we heard about the butler there, which did take its toll, certainly on the church and perhaps on him personally?
I think he's shown himself quite shrewd about the media. He's the first Pope to tweet, famously. I think he found there a kind of medium that he could handle. After all, the challenge of communicating in 140 characters is a good challenge for an intellectual. And I think he enjoyed that. He's also, of course, done interviews live where he allowed young people to send in questions. So I don't think he's intimidated by that. I think he's perhaps intimidated by the pace of it. I think not the reality of it, but the sheer pace of it.
Let me bring in some of our other guests. Fiona, I said to Alan Little there at the start, this is for somebody who is often considered to be a conservative, and we can debate that, but many people think he is very conservative on some issues. This was an amazingly radical step for him to take, wasn't it?
It was, but then again, he has been radical in a subdued way on other issues. So, for example, he is one of the first popes that we've seen really provide teaching in the moment that's relevant to the big questions that civil society are facing. Good example would be, as the world was wrestling with the causes of the economic crisis between 2007 and 2010, he was one of the first to come out and point out that everyone had been relying on market forces and, frankly, reward being enough to make people do the right thing, but that money without an ethical framework around it gets you into a lot of hot water very quickly. And so actually he has been a reformer, but perhaps a very understated one.
So do you think people are wrong to see him as a conservative then?
I think he's conservative in some ways, but I think there's been more to this pontificate than has met the eye, and his work to reform Vatican finances is another example where actually he has taken some steps to open up the Vatican. They just haven't perhaps caught the media's attention, or perhaps had the coverage that we will in the end realise they may have merited.
Well, let me bring in Lavinia Byrne in Bristol. I mean, how do you see him and see this legacy in terms of reform and change or otherwise?
Well, clearly he was always going to be a transitional pope. The cardinals who elected him knew he was an old man, and they must have envisaged a short period of office for him. What's intriguing is that he has removed himself, and on today of all days, the Feast of Our Lady of Lourdes, which is a day that is supposed to be all about healing and about health. So what this is, health-wise, what this means, is still intriguing, I think.
Are you, how can I put it, are you glad, frankly, that he has decided to go because you hope that the future may be more to your liking within the Church?
No, I think it would be ungracious to say that I was glad, because in my lifetime, there have been 7 popes. You know, popes come, popes go. The Church goes on forever. But I do envisage a future that is more open to addressing the critical question about how the Church inhabits the world. It's no good just condemning secularism. The Church must deal with the questions that are being raised by contemporary society and discern where God's will is.
Michael Walsh, I wonder if he suffers in comparison with his predecessor. I mean, there are those who, the famous quote was that if John Paul II had chosen another profession, he'd have been a film star, whereas Pope Benedict would have been a university professor. And there's something in that, isn't there?
Well, he was a university professor, of course, at the University of Tübingen and then at Regensburg. And I don't think that's true about John Paul II. He'd have probably been a footballer. But
right, but the point is the same, isn't it?
The point is the same, yes, I take it. I think one of the things that I feel about it, and I feel about what has already been said, is this managerial role. I mean, the Vatican is a very dysfunctional organisation at the moment. It was under the last years of his predecessor. In fact, he probably was throughout the whole of his time, Karol Wojtyła's time as Pope, as John Paul II. He really wasn't interested in that side of things. He wasn't interested in that side of things at all. So you've got a Pope coming in with a dysfunctional, and I think a lot of us thought that the election of a curial official, non-Italian, therefore without some of the traditional ties that they have, would be that he was chosen to reform the Curia. Well, that didn't happen. I mean, it has really got worse as all the revelations that came out with the butler's letters revealed to us. I think it's got much worse, and I think the money thing is an interesting one. I mean, you can't really say that he's reformed the you can't say he's reformed the finances, but you can't reform the Vatican money system when the banks, the European banks, have turned around and said we won't accept credit card transactions because you haven't got money laundering, adequate money laundering
legislation or structures in
place. Right.
Well, actually,
but hold on a second, that's not true.
Come back. Moneyval, which is the European Union's body for dealing with these issues, gave the Vatican, which had only just entered into the system of trying to comply with the Moneyval standards, they said that the Vatican city-state had made great progress, even though there was still more to be done. And everybody was frankly surprised when this bank turned around and suddenly withdrew the credit. I think that is a little bit of a red herring in this, because it's the Moneyval judgment, which is the European Union's judgment, which actually said that the Vatican City was heading in the right way, and that was Pope Benedict's initiative.
I know you want to come back on that, but I mean, for some people, the legacy of this Pope will be, unfortunately, the person on whose watch we all became aware of child abuse, and he didn't do enough to stop it.
And I think what we've got to recognise is he was on a learning curve as much as anybody else in society, getting his head round the phenomenon of paedophilia, the extent, the scale, the global scale of this issue, and did he learn enough, fast enough? Did he act? Did he go far enough? Those are all good questions that we have to ask. But what is for sure is that he is a Pope who was determined to tackle this head on. He was one of the first to actually meet repeatedly with victims at their request behind closed doors away from the glare of the media. He was the one who actually reformed canon law so that it was easier to expel abusers from the priesthood and also extended the statute of limitations.
But he got there eventually, and one of the criticisms is, A, he was slow, and B, actually at the start he covered it up.
I don't think it's fair to say that he covered it up. I think it's fair to say he was grappling to understand and get, frankly, the facts on the table to see the scale of the issue. Has he gone far enough and fast enough? Has he dealt with all of it? No. Is there more still to be done? Absolutely, but I think when we reflect on this pontificate, what we will see is that for the first time, the Church actually said, we have a huge problem, we have got this absolutely wrong, and we need to act and start to take steps in that direction.
Lavinia, you left over the issue of women in the Church and the role of women in the Church. I'm just wondering what challenges you foresee for his successor, and whether that person, perhaps, if he comes from Latin America or Africa, may just be a much greater symbol of a change within the Church.
Two things the new Pope has to deal with immediately. One is internal organisation. We need a man with a big broom who will go in and sort out the Vatican, sort out the Curia. But also we need somebody who is prepared to engage with the questions that really need addressing, particularly about the use of power in the Church. And that is why increasingly I go back to the role of women, because the Church had the idea it would be a good idea to educate girls, but what does it know? It doesn't seem to know what to do with educated women. And it seems to me all the questions about child abuse as well are really about the abuse of power rather than limit it to a sexual perspective. Clergy who are accountable for their use of power will not abuse so easily. And that's the key issue to be addressed, clerical power.
Do you agree with some of that?
I think that some of what Lavinia is saying has to be taken very, very seriously. I wouldn't put it in quite the stark terms that she does. I think if you take the issue about a big broom to clean out the Vatican, I think it's one of the most commonly said things about any incoming government is it's going to come to grips with the civil service. We have it here in Britain, and everybody complains about civil services. Civil services of all kinds always have internal difficulties, and any incoming leader has to grapple with those. I don't deny that. But I think to imagine that the Vatican has got a monopoly of those issues is quite wrong. And I know that Michael might feel differently to that. And I think, secondly, coming back to the women issue, the role of women in the Church, in the exercise of power in the Church, this is a very serious issue. I was very struck, though, that there was a cardinal, American cardinal, Cardinal Dolan, who said he thought that one way of carrying this forward was to have women cardinals. And, you know, for a cardinal of the Church to be saying that was an extraordinary step. And because there is actually no block to a woman cardinal, because you don't have to be ordained to be a cardinal.
Right.
So I think that there are some interesting ways
You have
forward.
to be a cleric to be a cardinal, however. You can't have women clerics.
And in terms of the big broom, I mean,
Yeah.
Do you think it would be refreshing if this were a non-European, given a lot of the
No,
scope of the Church?
I mean,
do you think that's irrelevant?
I'm afraid I part company with a lot of people on this, including I suppose I'm regarded to be on the liberal side of the Church, and most liberals would say, well, we ought to have a Latin American, we ought to have... But I don't go along with that, and I don't go along with it for this reason, and it's partly the management issue that you touched upon, that, in fact, what happens if you choose the very best man to run the Church, from wherever he is in the world? You've got a chief executive. You've got exactly what Christopher Jameson was saying he doesn't want. That is the notion. What Rome needs is a bishop. It's about time we got back to having a bishop of Rome instead of having a pontiff, a pope who governs the whole church in the way that he's been doing, really in fairly recent to the last couple of centuries. But basically, I think it would be a mistake to choose somebody from outside.
Final word.
I think we've got to look at this pontificate in the round. I think there are some good steps forward. There's more work still to be done. I think the issue of women and their ordination of the priesthood is a fascinating one, because it's not even to do with this pontificate. John Paul II came out and said this isn't about do we want to ordain women. It's actually just not an option that's on the books. But what is on the books, what Cardinal Ratzinger as he was and Pope Benedict as he is now has done more than anything, is to recognise that the laity, male and female, have a huge role to play, and it'll be interesting to see if the next Pope continues to build on that legacy.
OK, we'll leave it there. Thank you all very much.